October 22, 1707. Admiral Sir Cloudesley Shovel commanded 21 warships of the Royal Navy, returning from Gibraltar with nearly 2,000 men under his command. These weren't inexperienced merchant sailors or desperate travelers. These were the finest navigators England could produce, aboard the most powerful naval vessels in the world. That night, his navigators calculated their position with absolute confidence. They believed they were safely west of Ushant, clear of any danger, sailing through open water toward home. They were wrong by dozens of miles. At approximately 8 o'clock in the evening, 4 warships struck the granite rocks of the Scilly Isles in complete darkness. Within hours, between 1,400 and 2,000 sailors were dead. The admiral himself perished. Only 13 men survived from all 4 ships combined. 13 out of nearly 2,000. This wasn't some ancient medieval disaster from an age of ignorance. This happened in 1707 when England ruled the seas, and it reveals a horrifying truth about maritime travel that stretches back centuries. When medieval ships went down, almost nobody survived, not because they weren't trying, not because they were cowards, but because the ocean, the cold, and the ships themselves formed a perfect triangle of death that was mathematically, physiologically, physically impossible to escape. The water temperature in the North Atlantic averages 8 degrees Celsius in winter. The English Channel in November hovers around the same deadly range. The North Sea drops even lower, to 4 degrees in the depths of winter. These aren't just uncomfortable temperatures. They're calibrated for death, precise enough that your body will betray you in predictable, measurable ways. The moment you hit water that cold, your body gasps involuntarily. You cannot control it. Nobody can. It's called cold shock response, and it happens to everyone. That massive inhalation pulls in whatever surrounds your mouth. If your head was underwater for even half a second when it happened, you've just filled your lungs with seawater. Your heart rate explodes from 60 beats per minute to over 160. Your blood pressure spikes so dramatically that cardiac arrests can occur within the first 2 minutes. 20% of cold water immersion victims die right here, before hypothermia even begins. They're dead before they realize they're dying. For the 80% who survive cold shock, the next phase is worse. Your body immediately begins shutting down peripheral systems to protect your core temperature. Within 5 minutes, your hands stop working. Not gradually, they just stop. The nerve signals from your brain can't get through. You can see your hands in front of you, but they won't grip. They won't close into fists. They're just useless clubs of flesh at the ends of your arms. You can't pull yourself onto floating debris. You can't even bring your arms together to attempt proper swimming strokes. Now add the clothing. A medieval sailor wore wool tunics that absorbed 15 pounds of water or more. Leather boots that filled instantly, becoming weights strapped to your ankles. A woolen cloak, standard for anyone with means, would soak up so much seawater it could drag a strong swimmer straight to the bottom. You want to remove these death traps, but your fingers stopped working 30 seconds ago. You're watching yourself drown, fully conscious, completely helpless. This is how sailors died in medieval shipwrecks. Not after hours of valiant swimming, not heroically trying to save others, in minutes, sometimes in seconds. And the ship that was supposed to carry them to safety was often the thing that killed them first. If you're drawn to these dark corners of history, to the real stories of how our ancestors faced the unthinkable, then subscribe now, because we're diving deeper into historical horrors that textbooks never told you. These aren't just stories, they're warnings from the past, written in the lives of people who had no choice but to face them. Medieval ships were engineering disasters waiting to happen. Northern European vessels used clinker construction, with overlapping planks that created what builders called a flexible hull. Flexible sounds like a good thing until you understand what it actually meant. The ship literally bent and twisted in heavy seas. As cargo shifted, as waves pounded the hull, those overlapping planks would separate just enough to let water pour in. The caulking between planks, animal hair dipped in pitch, failed constantly. A ship that needed bailing only 3 times in 24 hours was considered seaworthy. Think about that. If your vessel only filled with water 3 times per day, captains considered it perfectly acceptable. Mediterranean ships used carvel construction with edge-to-edge planks, which should have been stronger. But medieval shipbuilders cut corners relentlessly. They used green timber that warped as it dried. They skimped on internal bracing. They built cargo holds as single open spaces with no subdivision, meaning once water got in, it sloshed freely from side to side. Each wave made the ship lean further until it couldn't recover. The Mary Rose, pride of Henry VIII's navy, demonstrated this perfectly on July 19, 1545. The warship was maneuvering in the Solent when someone left the lower gun ports open. As the ship heeled over in a turn, water poured through those openings directly onto the gun deck. Within minutes, over 350 men were trapped inside a capsizing vessel. The anti-boarding netting meant to keep enemies out during battle now trapped the crew inside. Men drowned just feet from the surface, clawing at rope nets they couldn't break through. But even if you somehow escaped the sinking ship, even if you survived cold shock and kept your head above water despite waterlogged clothing and failing hands, you faced another problem. There was no rescue coming. Medieval ships didn't carry lifeboats. Those small boats you see in period paintings were for transferring cargo in port. Most vessels had one, maybe two at most. During the White Ship disaster on November 25, 1120, that single boat became a death trap of its own. Prince William Adelin, heir to the English throne, was aboard when the vessel struck rocks off the Normandy coast. Crew members launched the boat to save him, but as soon as it hit the water, dozens of desperate survivors tried to climb in. The boat could hold perhaps 12 people. It capsized immediately, drowning everyone, including the prince. 300 people were aboard the White Ship that night. Only one survived, a butcher named Berold from Rouen. He grabbed a wooden spar from the ship's rigging and held on through the freezing November night. That's it. No heroic swimming, no clever survival tactics. He just happened to grab the right piece of wood and happened not to die from cold shock and happened to maintain consciousness long enough for local fishermen to find him the next morning. The heir to the English throne, protected by the ship's best sailors, died. Seasoned Norman knights who had survived multiple battles died. The captain who knew those waters better than anyone died. But a butcher who had probably never been in water over his head before lived. That's not a survival story. That's a statistical anomaly that proves the rule. Even Berold's impossible survival reveals the true horror. Medieval medicine had no concept of how to treat hypothermia or near drowning. Someone pulled from cold water who wasn't breathing would simply be declared dead. CPR wouldn't be developed for another 400 years. The idea that you could restart someone's heart, that you could bring them back from apparent death, was witchcraft to medieval minds. The few recorded attempts at resuscitation are almost tragic in their futility. Tobacco smoke blown into the rectum through bellows, rolling victims over barrels, hanging them upside down to drain water from their lungs. These weren't evidence-based treatments. They were desperate guesses by people with no understanding of human physiology. Even if you survived the drowning in the cold and were pulled from the water still breathing, infection would likely kill you within days. Any wound from the wreck, any cut from debris, any abrasion from ropes or wood became a death sentence in an era with no antibiotics, no sterile bandages, no understanding of germ theory. The standard treatment for infected wounds was cauterization with boiling oil, a cure that usually accelerated death through additional trauma and shock. The White Ship sinking changed English history. Berold's survival testimony confirmed Prince William's death, triggering 20 years of civil war over succession. One man's freakish survival had consequences that rippled through centuries, but for every Berold there were thousands who simply vanished. Ships that left port and never arrived were eventually presumed lost, but nobody knew where or when or how. The ocean swallowed them whole, leaving no trace except perhaps bodies washing ashore weeks later if the currents were favorable. Medieval sailors signed on knowing these odds because the alternative was starving on land. The profit margins on successful voyages were so high that merchants accepted death rates as business costs. Entire family lines ended in single wrecks. Entire neighborhoods became quarters of widows. And still, people kept sailing, kept dying, kept feeding themselves to an ocean that never once showed mercy. Leave a comment below. If you had been born in medieval times, would you have taken the risk and gone to sea, or would the odds have kept you on land? Sometimes the most terrifying part of history is realizing how little choice people actually had.